The region I am focusing on in this presentation is medieval Transylvania, which was located at the easternmost part of the medieval Kingdom of Hungary, as already shown by Professor Béla Zsolt-Szakács, now a part of Romania, and it comprised one of the eastern border region of Western artistic influences throughout the Middle Ages. Transylvania preserves a remarkably rich heritage of medieval wall paintings, which has significantly increased during the last few decades due to ongoing new discoveries. But while many recent studies have been dedicated to wall painting ensembles from the 14th to the early 16th century, fragments surviving from the preceding period, that is the 13th century, have hardly received any attention in art historical literature. In this presentation, I focus on a group of Romanesque churches from the southern part of the region, which preserve fragments of their early layers of medieval wall painting decoration datable to the 13th century or to around 1300. This southern part of the Transylvania was populated by the Transylvanian Saxons, already introduced by Professor Béla Zsolt-Szakács, a German-speaking population with diverse origin, colonized from the mid-12th century onwards by Hungarian kings with the aim to secure the southeastern borders of the kingdom. Their earliest churches, still standing today, were built in the first half of the 13th century and were typically three-aisled basilicas. While it has been repeatedly suggested in earlier literature that these churches were usually not decorated with wall paintings, besides consecration crosses, a survey of surviving fragments makes it necessary to nuance this view. While in most churches a small number of isolated compositions from this early period are preserved, a recent discovery in Cisnadie of a large painted surface provides a unique opportunity to partially reconstruct the decoration program of a Romanesque basilica covering the chancel, triumphal arch, as well as the clerestory walls and the piers of the nave, even if in most cases only the preparatory drawings and the impression of colors survive fragmentarily. In order to fit in a time frame, I will focus on two wall painting ensembles, the ones in Cinku and Cisnadie, which I have chosen because no art historical publication has been published on them so far, even though in both cases more than small fragments survive, but I will draw into the analysis the other ensembles from this period as well. In addition to presenting both ensembles where possible, I will look at artistic connections with other regions and will examine to what extent the decoration programs of the different parts of the church interiors fit into general tendencies widespread in other regions or show characteristics that can be regarded as locally specific. In Cinku, two compositions belonging to the first layer of wall painting survive. On the northern nave wall, above the entrance to the northeastern tower base, next to the chancel arch, a representation of the martyrdom of Saint Lawrence was painted, which is now only partially revealed and not restored. In the foreground of the composition, the naked body of the martyr saint can be discerned, tied to a grid painted almost parallel to the picture plane, in a composition somewhat comparable to a miniature in the St. Elizabeth's Psalter dating from the beginning of the 13th century. Below the grid, the small logs arranged diagonally and the flames forming the stake can be seen. At least four figures surrounding the stake can be discerned, two of whom are fanning the fire with the bellows. One man is presumably holding a long-handled two-pronged pitchfork. Most emphatic among the group of tormentors is the figure of a bearded man wearing a tunic-like white garment and holding a long stick-like object. His head, captured in profile with caricature-like features, is well comparable with one of the male heads in the portfolio of Viag the posture of the head and the neck, the large eyes looking upwards, the wavy eyebrows, the pronounced indentation between the lower lip and chin, the headgear and the curls of hair emerging from underneath it are all comparable. On the same folio in Viag sketchbook, we can see the ground plan of one of the towers of Laon Cathedral and an accompanying description. The male head appearing upside down at the bottom of the page is considered unrelated to lawn, and its source is unknown. A further example of this head type, used by the painter in Cinku, can be found in a small village church in Csepeszkopács in western Hungary, as the head of one of the apostles in the Alps, dated to the end of the 13th century. Although here the similarities are somewhat less pronounced, some common features include the distinctive profile with a prominent forehead and pronounced indentation under the lower lip or the downward curve of the eyes and eyelids. Below the martyrdom scene, the round arched niche of the portal leading to the tower base was framed by a decorative band made up of pretzel-shaped leaf tendril motifs, of which now only a section is revealed. We find several analogies for this motif, typically from around the second quarter of the 13th century, for instance in the wall painting decoration of the dome in Braunschweig. A geographically closer example can be found on the cornice of the main apse of the Abbey Church in Jak in western Hungary. A further group of fragments belonging to the earliest layer of wall painting in Cinku is now located in the attic above the late Gothic vault of the nave. Here, a somewhat similar but simpler decorative frame made up of pretzel-shaped vegetal motifs runs along the upper part of the chancel arch. For this motif, we can find parallels in German and Austrian territories from the first half of the 13th century, in the already mentioned dome in Braunschweig, among other examples. Below this decorative frame, a series of fragmentary heads encircled by red halos survive. These figures possibly belonged to an apostolic gallery as part of a monumental Last Judgment painted on the western side of the chancel arch. Turning to my second example, the church in Cisnedia, as I mentioned, here large amounts of painted surfaces belonging to the first wall painting layer were revealed during the recent renovation of the church. On the walls of the main apse, fragments of an apostolic gallery survive. While the Romanesque semi-dome has been replaced by a late Gothic vault, it is probable that the Majestas Domini was originally represented here. This hypothesis is supported by a fragmentary motif preserved above the eastern window, which was possibly the lower corner of Christ's mandorla. A combination of images of Christ in majesty flanked by the evangelist symbols on the wall with an apostolic gallery painted on the apse wall below was of course a common scheme of apse decorations in Romanesque churches across Europe, with several examples known from the territory of the Kingdom of Hungary as well. In Transylvania, one more example from this period is preserved in the fragmentary wall paintings in Homorod, dated to around 1300, where the Majestas Domini is represented with the four evangelist symbols, is flanked by seraphs, as well as the figures of the interceding Virgin Mary and Saint John the Baptist. Turning back to Cisnedia, while the visual program of the semi-dome and apse walls, as we have seen, probably followed a fairly common scheme, all the more peculiar is the decoration of the eastern window splay, where we can see Saint Walburga, the patron saint of the church, and facing her a priestly figure identified by an inscription as Petrus Plebanus. His privileged position seems striking even for an ecclesiastic donor figure. Located in the eastern side of the chancel, in the same register with the apostolic gallery, he is represented in the same size as the patron saint of the church, in a permanent face-to-face prayer directed towards her. If we look for contemporary visual conventions of representing priestly donor figures, we can see that in Purg in Styria, a priestly donor figure was painted as the pendant of a lay donor, not in the chancel, but still in an important position on the chancel arch. On the eastern wall of the Bishop's Kapelle in Gurk, two bishops were represented in a significantly smaller scale than the figures of the Virgin Mary and the surrounding figures of virtues. An association somewhat comparable to the one seen in Cisnedia of an ecclesiastic donor with the patron saint of the church on the eastern chancel wall can be seen on a stained glass in the church in Ardager in Lower Austria, showing scenes from the life of Saint Margaret and Provost Henry as a dollar figure below. We can see that in comparison with these examples, the privileged position of parish priest Petrus, visually featured almost as if an equal to the patron saint, seems unparalleled. In the introduction of the arch separating the apse from the choir, 6 figures of prophets were painted, 4 as busts and 2 as full figures. This iconographic arrangement must have been common in the region, as fragments in Homorod and Cisnadiara suggest, both probably showing busts of prophets in medallions. On the two side walls of the choir in Cisnadia, a Christological cycle was painted, originally in 3 registers. On the northern wall, we can see a thoughtfully composed detail of this cycle, well adapted to the wall surface, while the window is enclosed by 2 larger scenes, the Adoration of the Magi and the Presentation in the Temple. In the lower register, 4 scenes of smaller proportion can be seen, the first 2 of which, the Crucifixion and the Deposition from the Cross, are built around the central motif of the cross, while the next 2, the Entombment and the Resurrection, the motif of the tomb. Decorating the choir walls with scenes of the Incarnation and Passion of Christ, forming a suitable context for the Mass sacrifice, must have been again a common pattern in the region. Fragments of a Christological cycle painted on the choir walls are preserved in Homorod as well. On the choir vault in Cisnadia, the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse were depicted in a way more or less corresponding to the text of the Revelation what regards their attributes and the color of the horses. The first rider appears on a white horse, equipped with a scepter and a crown symbolizing his victory. The second rider on a red horse, holding a bow and arrow, representing war. The third rider on a black horse, holding a small scale in his hand, symbolizing famine. And finally, the fourth rider on a yellow horse with a sword in his right hand, wearing a crown. He is described in the Revelation as dead himself. Even though the 4 apocalyptic horsemen would have been an obvious subject for the decoration of cross vaults, especially in the chancels, given the number 4 of the figures, their composition fitting well the triangular fields of the vault, and the liturgical connotation of the Book of Revelation, this theme was not particularly common. Compared to the rareness of these representations of the 4 apocalyptic horsemen in medieval monumental art in general, striking is their recurrence in the Transylvania Saxon region, where besides Cisnadia, this theme appears in the lunettes of the chancel vault in Alcuna in the 14th century, and based on fragments surviving on the choir vault in Homorod, probably depicting a galloping horse, it is possible that the apocalyptic horsemen were depicted here as well. And it cannot be excluded that this recurrence of the theme in this region goes back to a common local model, possibly a significant monument of Romanesque wall painting, later destroyed. In the nave, primarily the clerestory walls provided suitable surfaces for monumental compositions. The northern clerestory wall was filled by a monumental Last Judgment, of which details of the judging Christ enthroned in a mandorla, flanked by the apostles, survive in the upper register, with fragments of the resurrected below. An interesting detail can be seen on one of the piers, where a wolf-like animal appears next to a naked figure with his head apparently separated from his torso, and it appears as if the wolf was holding the head in its open mouth, which may recall representations of the theme under a Byzantine influence, such as the mosaic in Torcello, where wild animals spit out the human body parts they had previously swallowed, so that the dead can resurrect. One of them here is even holding a head in his mouth. Perhaps in Cisnadia, we see the moment when the severed head is reunited with the body. And again, decorating the northern clerestory wall of Romanesque basilicas with the monumental Last Judgments might have been a common pattern in the region, as fragments dated around 1300 in Greco suggest. On the southern clerestory wall, a representation of the Throne of Mercy was painted. We can see God the Father enthroned in a mandorla, and a smaller proportion figure of the crucified Christ held by God the Father, with the dove of the Holy Spirit hovering before his chest. In the upper part of the composition, 2 incense-burning angels were painted, while in the lower corners the allegorical figures of ecclesia and synagogue. The combination of the figures of ecclesia and synagogue with the Throne of Mercy is an iconographic rarity, and while these figures only fragmentarily survive, they can be reconstructed based on analogies. Ecclesia, positioned to the right of the Trinity as an embodiment of the Christian Church, was, according to iconographic conventions, probably a female figure wearing a crown, possibly hallowed, turned towards the crucified Christ, holding a banner with a cross, a fragment of which survives in one hand, while probably raising her other hand, holding a chalice to catch the blood of Christ. This motif, horizontal at the top, then continuing downwards in a curve to the right of the banner, might have been the chalice, a permanent attribute of ecclesia. In the analogies, ecclesia is riding a four-headed creature, the tetramorph, each head of which corresponds to one of the evangelist symbols. Here, 2 heads are preserved, probably of the ox and the lion. The figure synagogue on the iconographic left side of the Trinity appears as an embodiment of Judaism bearing a negative connotation. Her posture and attributes emphasize her defeat in contrast to the victory of ecclesia. She is turned away from Christ, the crown is falling from her head, tilted to the side, her eyes are blindfolded, suggesting her spiritual blindness. Her flag is torn in two, the flagpole is broken in 2 places, and instead of the chalice referring to the mass sacrifice, she is holding the head of a ram, as in the analogies, as a reference to the Old Testament sacrifice. Particularly interesting is that while in most representations, Synagogue is riding a donkey, here she is riding a creature reminiscent of the animal ridden by Ecclesia, but having 3 heads, one distinguished by horns and a goat's beard, the other by tusks. While analogies can be found where instead of a donkey, Synagogue's riding animal is a goat, pig, camel, or dragon, at all events some lowly, impure, evil being, her representation with a 3-headed creature seems unparalleled so far. While images of the Throne of Mercy are most commonly surrounded by the evangelist symbols, appearing of the theme with the figures of ecclesia and synagogue also seems an iconographic rarity so far unparalleled. The only analogy known to me is much later, a panel attributed to Robert Campen representing the related Node-Gottes image type, where the figures of ecclesia and synagogue appear as statues on God the Father's throne. The source of this composition in Cisnadia, presenting an exceptionally rare iconography, is so far unknown to me. But in some respects it can be compared to a miniature in the St. Elizabeth Psalter, if we look at the shape and color of the mandorla or the incense-burning angels, which are also not usual in representations of the Throne of Mercy. And while the figures of ecclesia and synagogue represent a type which is usually traced back to an Alsatian manuscript, the Hortus Deliciarum, with the closest analogies to be found in the Western German regions. In conclusion, even though the exact channels of artistic exchange cannot in most cases be reconstructed, as only a fraction of 13th century wall paintings and their visual sources are now preserved, in Transylvania but also elsewhere in Europe, it is clear that these Transylvanian wall paintings were closely tied to artistic phenomena in Austrian and German territories, with many parallels with Western German regions. And even though only fragments of the early wall painting decoration of Romanesque basilicas in the Transylvania Saxon region are preserved, I hope that they are an interesting addition to 13th century wall painting, which has not been discussed so far. Thank you.